All right, folks. The Mic Check podcast is live here with Steve Kim formerly of ESPN, now currently writing a bi-weekly double column every week, I should say, for snack.com now. Really appreciate you, Steve, for coming on. A lot of news to get to, a lot of big things going on in the boxing world. And if we have the time to, we'll even get to touch on a little bit of NFL football, because we all know that Steve, if you follow Steve, he's a big football fan as well. So welcome to the show, Steve. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, anytime, Quinton. Glad to join you.
Absolutely. So first thing we were just going to want to talk about, and I did have about 4 or 5 topics listed here that I wanted to kind of get your input on, Steve. First thing I wanted to mention was what do you think currently is one of the biggest hang-ups or the biggest issues that we're currently seeing in boxing that maybe we didn't have as an issue previously, in your opinion, having covered the sport for so long?
Well, Q, I think a lot of the issues that plague boxing have been around for a while. Here's what I think one of the bigger issues is. It's not even the fact that there are so many promoters that are competing with one another, because there used to be a time and place when a fight was ready to be made, guys would just co-promote. Like, let's say Trinidad and De La Hoya, with Oscar De La Hoya, promoter being Bob Arum, Don King representing Felix Trinidad. More and more we're talking about fights, whether they can be made or not, based on the simple politics of the sport. But I think a more recent issue is that because we have so many major promoters, so you have Top Rank, who's on ESPN, PBC, who's on Showtime. They've been on other networks like Fox. You have Golden Boy, which has worked regularly with the Zone, and Matchroom with the Zone. And what's happening is that there's basically 4 different leagues of boxing. And so what happens is certain fights just simply cannot happen. I've said this for years, Q, that the sanctioning bodies have not held up as many fights as exclusive network contracts. And I think that's big. And, look at this recent situation with Jose Ramirez not fighting Regis Prograis, because he had a fallback position, because he had a promoter in Top Rank that has a deal with ESPN. So he's going to be fighting Richard Comey, a kind of a faded, blown-up lightweight, on his network, where Regis Prograis now has to look for a fight. And I'll be honest, I like Jose Ramirez, but he took the path of less resistance, and I'd much rather see Prograis fight Jose Ramirez. If I'm ESPN, I have to have a little bit of quality control and tell Top Rank, we don't want the Comey Ramirez fight. I think someone has to be the buffer to protect us as fans, to say, no, that's not up to our standards. Try to make that Prograis fight. But unfortunately, a lot of the networks and platforms now serve as the co-promoter, since they are in bed with them. So I would say that is probably one of the bigger issues we face in the sport of boxing.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think it's really interesting because you made an interesting parallel on Twitter a few days ago. I think it was actually yesterday, mentioning about how people have reacted and responded to the Stephen Fulton, Naoya Inoue fight seemingly about to happen in a very similar situation that Jose Ramirez was in, where one guy we kind of anticipated wouldn't take the fight just because of the simple fact that he's with PBC. PBC seems to be one of those networks that's very, very exclusive to in-house fights, versus a situation with Jose Ramirez where we've seen at times Jose even himself has crossed over to the Zone and had fights on other platforms. So a little bit surprised on my end that Jose wasn't able to get this fight over the line and really go ahead and go for the challenge, because, he was set up to take the WBC title originally before he decided to pass on the shot this past summer.
Right. And Q, here's the thing. Jose Ramirez had options. But let's be honest, his brain trust probably doesn't think that they could beat Regis Prograis. Because if they did, and if the money was good enough, they would have done the same thing they did against Maurice Hooker when that fight was on the Zone. But unfortunately, there isn't $4.5 million at stake like there was. The other thing is, Rick Morigian, a guy that I've known well for the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, he says, well, we're not in the same position, this, and that. Jose Ramirez has made millions, and he's a draw. We're going to do a big gate in Fresno. All of that is true, Quinton. You know what's funny, though, Quinton? Me and you get none of that piece. We are not shareholders. So as boxing fans and observers, get this, we actually care about the fights. Do I think that Fulton and Ramirez are a perfect are they perfectly analogous in the positions they are in? No. But as boxing fans, we have to stop being fanagers with the F and really just understand who's making the fights that we want. It's really a simple concept.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think one of the other things that's unique to the situation when you talk about Jose Ramirez in the situation where, he may be not favored, isn't there an argument to be made that if you take a fight as a guy who's the B side, who comes in as the underdog, but you have a good showing, you lose that fight, you're still rewarded, because that's how it used to be, right? When guys would take 50-50 fights or fights where they might be, the betting underdog, if they have a good showing in that fight, it leads to higher purses moving forward. It leads to better opportunities moving forward as well.
There used to be a time, I'll give you a story. Vince Phillips in 1996 lost the fight to Ike Cortez. It was a real shootout, but he got overwhelmed late. He was more of a 140-pounder, more than a welterweight. So that fight was on HBO, but Lou DiBella, who acted as like the buffer, he was the boxing czar for the network. Long before he was a promoter, that's what he thrived at. Lou DiBella said, you know what, I really like Vince Phillips. I don't care that he got knocked down 4 rounds. Doesn't matter to me. He's an exciting fighter. I will make sure he gets back on the air. I will not punish him for going up, taking on a monster. He'll have his shot. Less than a year later, at 140, he beat Kostya Tszyu. Just ramrodded him with right hands late, and then he was able to sprout and have a pretty lucrative run. Unfortunately, we are now in a position where fighters fight so little or so infrequently. Everybody seems to be very, very risk averse. And I don't think there's enough network pressure to knock guys off. They, in fact, want to pressure people into fighting. And it's gotten so bad, Q. We are now seeing fighters turn down mandatory title shots as the challenger. It's ridiculous. I never thought I would see that. And to me, where are the checks and balances? I'll say this. Jaime Munguia used to be one of my favorite fighters. He's literally turned down 3 title shots.
Great example.
3 title shots.
Ryan Garcia as well.
Ryan Garcia did 2 eliminators, never fought Devin Haney. So there's a reason why he says, well, when belts don't matter, no, they don't matter to you when you have to fight Devin Haney. Let's be real about that. Jaime Munguia could have fought Jermell Charlo. Network politics got in the way. Then it was Janibek. Who's Janibek? Too risky. And then Demetrius Andrade stayed away from him like the plague. One of the things that I think they should implement, Q, is very simple. If you are a number 1 contender, and when your mandatory shot gets called, if you turn down the fight, you get bounced from the rankings, because you are not going to be that 18-wheeler that tips over on the freeway holding up traffic. Get the fuck out the way. Really? Because if you're see, a lot of these guys squat on a rating. They don't get to number 1 to say, okay, now we're going to see if this guy vacates and maybe we'll have an No. Could you imagine Marvin Hagler doing that? I mean, honestly, it's just ridiculous. So this is where we come into, and then going back to Munguia, when I actually heard from my good friend Eric Gomez the name Dimitri Bivol, I said, this is bizarro world. You didn't fight any of the major middleweights, but you're going to fight that guy at light heavyweight?
You're going to skip 2 weights,
It's no sense. It makes no sense whatsoever.
Yeah. And I think one of the unique things about this whole situation, where you mentioned the dynamic of people sitting on their ratings, I've mentioned this before on previous podcasts and just wanted to kind of get your thoughts on it. I've even suggested that maybe what should be done is you take the first 6 months of the year and you allow titleists to have all of these mandatory fights, right? These mandatory fights with their direct challengers and stuff like that. And then the last 6 months of that same calendar year is where you start mandating these champions to unify with each other. And I think that would be a really great thing, because we get to see clear as day who's not taking the fights that we want to see and who are the guys that are trying to take the fights we want to see. Because I think we see a lot of that sitting on rankings when we talk about guys with belts. A great example of that to me is Jermall Charlo.
Yeah.
A guy who hasn't fought in a year and a half, and he's just satisfied with having a WBC title because the WBC hasn't mandated him to fight anybody. And when they do come back to mandate him to fight him, to have somebody to fight him, it's going to be a situation where it's going to be a fight where nobody's really asking for it.
Yeah, Q, that's another issue. Look at the run of Gary Russell. Every year for a champion, he fought once a year. And I looked one time during the it was during the pandemic. I was just had some free time, and I looked at the WBC laws or the regulations. You know, they actually say you have to defend your title twice. So the issue that takes place, Q, is that many of the sanctioning bodies are always closely aligned with certain promoters.
Right.
We know who they are. Like the WBO, I've joked in the past, we're Bob's organization. They do a lot of business with Top Rank.
Definitely do.
Yeah. WBA, with all their regular titles that go to the PBC, I call them Weeby Als. So they're all in business with each other. So even in theory, if they implemented your plan, it doesn't work it works against their own best interest. And here's what I think is happening. Because of the multiple networks and the fractured nature of the business, every promoter tries to get that one or two belt holder in every division and then try to market that fight when that guy's television date comes up. Hey, we have the middleweight championship, the welterweight championship. And they try to fool the public into thinking, even though there's 4 belts in a division, hey, this is a champion. They don't tell you which champion. In fact, the PBC for years acted like Terrence Crawford never existed.
Yes, I was just going to come on to that. Yes. And it's a unique situation now that Fulton is in because rumors are, right, that he's going to make this fight in Japan. We'll wait to see if he actually gets on the plane, lands, gets there, and gets in the ring. I'll reserve my right to see that fight and hold off judgment until then because I still have, some reservations about whether the fight will actually happen. But it's for a title that it seems like in a lot of cases the PBC doesn't really care about when you talk about that WBO title. Were you at all surprised that we've gotten this far with negotiations between Fulton and Inoue as far as trying to get this fight made and that he's agreeing to go ahead and travel?
Yeah, I think we all have skepticism for good reason. But when it came to Fulton, if you actually look at his timeline and certain media outlets that are very friendly with him, they were kind of hinting that, hey, don't believe everything you've read. Don't fall in line to everything that you've been led to believe. I was told, Q, by a very good source, the main driver, and this should be a lesson to every fighter, Fulton made it very clear, you're not embarrassing me, and that's a lot of yen. I want that yen. That's a career-high payday and a chance to make history. You better give me that fight. And that, in fact, one tweet of his, he actually said, I'm ready to air people out. He said that about a week and a half ago. He said, I am ready to talk. And I think that they're like, okay, you mean business. More fighters need to do that. Like when I hear Jose Ramirez, who I've had a great relationship with, he may not like what I'm saying, complaining where he says, well, I'm being thrown under the bus. Right, Jose, because you laid down right in the middle of the street. You allowed that to happen. You allowed that to happen. So that's my point is like, Jose, you made a business decision, and most fans, since we don't get a percentage cut, we're not part of this Ponzi scheme, we're not going to like it. For Stephen Fulton, who decides to take the bull by the horns and say, you know what, I'm going to give fans or be a part of a fight, and you got to give Inoue credit because he's not taking a tune-up. He's going right into the deep end of the pool at 122. Absolutely. But Fulton is going to be praised. Bottom line, So,
absolutely.
So Fulton himself took the initiative to say, you know what? I'm going to act like a chess master, but not a pawn. There's a difference.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And one of the other things before we move on from that specific fight there that I'd like the fans to really realize too is, Fulton is the boxer in this fight, right? He's the guy that more than likely, if he has the fight his way, he sees the 12th round with this fight, and he's relying on judging. And that's been a trepidation, I know, a lot of times for other fighters when it comes to traveling to other fighters' backyard, especially guys who are fan favorites. So even more credit goes to him if he does go ahead and cross that bridge, go to Japan, and definitely go ahead and take that fight there because he's going to be at an obvious disadvantage, not only from, the home field advantage part, but also possibly from a judging standpoint if the fight is close.
Yeah.
Next, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right. But this is what you call risk versus reward. I would be willing to bet that based on what he's going to make, as opposed to a Brandon Figueroa rematch, it's worth the risk. I'm told that because of the Amazon Prime deal and the overall popularity of Inoue in Japan, he probably touches 8 figures. That's why it's actually very difficult for Top Rank to bring him out to the United States, because the going is good there.
Yeah.
I mean, the money he makes, that buys a lot of Hello Kitties. And just by being, look, if Paul Butler, relatively unknown guy, for a bantamweight title, the last belt, made $900,000, I would be willing to bet Fulton must be getting at least 2 to 3.
Oh yeah. If Paul Butler, a relatively unknown guy, a guy who got elevated, really didn't even technically win the title in the ring and didn't have any big defenses before that fight, is making nearly $1 million. Definitely safe to say that Fulton should get at least twice that for sure. Next topic I wanted to mention to you and just wanted to get your thoughts on. Currently, right now, and I kind of mentioned this in the tweet, and I think you saw it a couple of days ago on the timeline, just talking about potential pay-per-views that we could be getting across the board as U.S. boxing fans. Between the months of March, April, and May, there's potentially going to be 7 pay-per-views in a 10 or 11-week span if everything goes according to what the rumors have been. What's been really your thoughts with the decline of the number of people buying pay-per-views, but promoters still going ahead and putting these fights on pay-per-view anyway? What's kind of your thinking on that, and what kind of do you think is going to be the effect with all these pay-per-views in the next couple of months?
Well, I've said this for a few years, and I remember some of the industry people would almost act as if it didn't exist, but I felt that streaming from about 7-8 years ago, as it became more and more technically advanced and they improved, it was no longer just Justin TV, where the stream would look like some kind of a broadcast through an aquarium. And all you had to do was just basically get a link. It wasn't like getting a black box. You didn't have to get any special feed like you had to back in the olden days. That this was going to be an issue. And I don't think they've ever properly addressed pirating. And I don't know if you ever can. It's like plugging a hole in the dike. You put your finger in one hole, another one pops up. That's just the reality. Also, the quality of fights, like any welterweight fight that you say, I want to put on a pay-per-view, or in welterweight fighter, let's say Errol Spence, Keith Thurman, that doesn't involve Spence and Crawford in the same ring at the same time, there's going to be a backlash. There really is. And Q, this is another thing that I wrote years ago. I always asked, hey, guys, why are pay-per-views suddenly $70, $80? There was never I get there's inflation. This one, we cannot blame Biden. I'm sorry. Somewhere along the way, after Mayweather-Pacquiao, which went to $100, they didn't reset all the way back to 50, 60. They settled in at 70, 80. So you put all those factors together, quality of fights not being high, the lack of developing a star because nobody really fights that much. A lot of guys with under 20 fights who think they're pay-per-view. And then you have the average cost. Then something that you brought up, Q, like you said, is the frequency. It is now becoming a time. There used to be a rule in the pay-per-view industry that, and there used to be a gentleman's agreement with everybody. That was hard to adhere to, but they did. Nobody in boxing wanted to put a pay-per-view within a month of each other for a very simple reason, because that would kill your cable bill. And if you have limited resources or a nagging wife, and they look at that bill, and all of a sudden for 1 month it's $320. But you got some explaining to do.
Absolutely.
So, and another reason is, one of the reasons why you put a fight on pay-per-view, and people do not understand this, it's really not about big money. Sometimes a fighter or a certain fight may not fit within a budget of the network. So if the network slashes its cost or the expenditure per year, they're going to naturally have to put some fights on the pay-per-view platform and hope that the public buys it. Now, let me explain something about pay-per-view. You don't need to do 1 million buys all the time to have a successful pay-per-view. This is very much fundamental, simple math. If both of your fighters are making relatively low amounts of money or guarantee, let's say under $1.5 million to 2 million, and they have to play off the upside. If you do a pay-per-view of, I would say, 250,000, which used to be the norm, you
Mm-hmm.
can make money. Just do the math.
Right.
250 times 75, half of that goes to the cable and satellite industry. Do the math. It actually works. The problem is many of these fighters are now guaranteed much more
Mm-hmm.
because they are under exclusive contract. You want to keep them away from other companies. And so the math simply does not work. And Q, there used to be a time, long time ago, when I first got in the business in the mid to late 90s. I was working at a station called Extra AM 1150, doing sports updates. I did a weekly boxing show. When pay-per-view business was really much different and bigger than it is now,
Right.
I would say 3-4 days after an event, there used to be a fax. Yeah, that's how old it is. There used to be a fax that would come through from HBO or Showtime Sports telling you Mike Tyson Holyfield did 1.8 million buys, generating $98 million. It's the seventh. They'd give you all that info. They did that for years.
Right.
Now they leak out, hey, tell everyone it did 200,000 as if that's some big number.
Right.
That's how much
Right.
it's changed.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely had a lot of changes in the last probably 20 to 30 years, 100%. And you've been covering the sport throughout that time. Just wanted to remind everybody that's joining, thank you for listening. Thank you for the comments and the feedback. We got Steve Kim, formerly from ESPN, now working for Snack.com, former boxing reporter, current boxing reporter, as well as other sports as well. So we really appreciate Steve taking the time to join us. While we're on the topic of pay-per-views, Steve, I think when you mentioned about the 250 window, right, that used to be really profitable, one of the people that comes straight to my mind is Gervonta Davis, a guy who's a great ticket seller across the country. He's proven that he's been able to sell tickets in multiple venues, regardless of region. But the one thing that he hasn't been able to get over the hurdle of is that 300,000 mark when it comes to pay-per-view buys. And I've always said, and in my opinion of it is that they're putting him in with guys that are cheaper, more affordable, and not really anybody that has a true hope of beating him. And that's really hurting his buy rate because ultimately they're having to guarantee him a little bit more. So they're not able to afford the kind of guys that they should be putting him in with. Thus, they're able to make a little bit of money on the pay-per-views, even though he's not cracking 300,000. But it's not a fight that anybody's really clamoring for or desiring because of their adverseness with working with other promoters.
I would say all of that is correct, and there's still a big debate over what exactly his last fight did. You can choose to believe whatever sources you want, but it's really amazing. Think about the standards we're holding Canelo Alvarez to, that when he only does $500,000 to $1 million, people think it's a failure. Think about that, Q. He's literally doing 2 times more than anyone on his disappointing events. Just think about that. As it relates to Gervonta, there's no doubt in my view, he is among the top 2 or 3 ticket sellers in America. And as for the pay-per-view, you're right. The dance partner matters. I actually have done stories on this. Even a guy like Oscar De La Hoya, when he fought at Trinidad, those numbers were very high. When he fought at Fernando Vargas, those numbers are high. H. Chavez, the second fight, because the first fight was closed circuit, were very high. When he fought Wilfredo Rivera, not as high. It matters. People have this perception that guys like De La Hoya, Pacquiao, and Mayweather can be like a concert, like they're Janet Jackson or Whitney, that a solo performance can derive a big number. Maybe they can, but their numbers will fluctuate. That's been the truth with every pay-per-view, because if you can Google this, and I've done stories on it. De La Hoya did some unbelievable numbers. 1.2, 1.5. Other fights, the fight with Mayweather, I believe, crossed over 2 million. But there are fights that did about 250 to 400. And you know what the difference is, though, Q? De La Hoya, during his early run with Oscar, with Bob Arum, I did a story on his 1997 as the most popular famous fighter in boxing in 1997. He went on a campaign to seal his fate as a superstar by fighting 5 times. It's amazing. It'll never happen anymore. There's a myriad of reasons why, but he made the commitment and he had the flexibility because he can do pay-per-view. So in essence, create his own date. He did 4 fights on pay-per-view, fought David Kamau on HBO. Both Bob and Oscar told me one of the reasons why they could do it is every fight, they looked at that fight, whether it was Pernell Whitaker, Miguel Ángel Gonzalez, Camacho, or Rivera, they figured out what's this fight worth. And once they got that, then they said, okay, Oscar, I can guarantee you this. Let's work off the pay-per-view upside, or you could take a lower guarantee and risk it. If we hit certain benchmarks, you're going to make more money than I even wanted to give you. But every fight had a different value. Right. Too many contracts today, whether they fight King Kong, Godzilla, Quinton, or Steve Kim, it's the same value. It makes no sense. It makes no sense. And a lot of people in the boxing business have told me, Steve, you're absolutely right. We'd love to get rid of it, but here's the problem. If we don't guarantee these guys certain minimums across the board for years, someone else will. That's the problem.
Yeah. No doubt. And I think that kind of comes back to the first thing we talked about when we talked about competing networks, right? Having multiple promoters bringing you fights is good in certain aspects, right? When it comes to, having, multiple fight nights, having, a fight every weekend, it seems like throughout the year. It's great for us as fans because we have more boxing to consume and more options that we can choose from. But it also kind of dilutes the pool, so to speak, when it comes to those high-quality matchups. Because you're talking about a bunch of guys fighting in less competitive fights because these promoters don't have to necessarily work together to make the most money they can. They can just go on and do their own thing and make all these in-house fights.
Q, networks have always had allegiances and deals. They've had... But there hasn't been, I think, this much division ever. But I will say this. In a perfect world, if I was the commissioner of boxing, Commissioner Kim, the first thing I would say is if you're going to be a network who's going to be involved in boxing, you cannot be in bed with one sole promoter. You have to be agnostic. You absolutely have to just tell a promoter, look, I want to work with you regularly, but I'm just not going to give you 12 dates off the top. But if you give me good fights, I'll buy those piecemeal, one by one. Let's create a relationship. I will be very easy to work with if you keep giving me good stuff. But if you're just going to give me a series of house fights where the red corner consistently beats the blue corner and I see one upset a year, that doesn't fly. That's in essence what we have on most shows. We have to be fair about it. It's not just one company. The other thing that we're missing, Q, to go back, that hurts, we don't have a Friday night fights or a USA's Tuesday night fight series which would give fighters or mid-range promoters opportunities to develop guys like Ruslan Provodnikov or to see like guys who are lesser-known belt holders kind of stay busy and build their name. Remember Shane Mosley in the late 90s?
Yeah.
He was on USA a couple times, even after being a champion, and then he even fought on TNT. He had to find his way before he became a full-blown HBO guy. We need another series, more series like Showbox, with a bigger budget where if you're not attached to a major promoter, but if you want to fight for like pretty good amount of money as you build yourself and graduate to that next level, I think that element is very much missed in this sport.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that would actually lead a lot to what you were saying before when you talk about Oscar having 5 fights in 1 year. The guys who have the flexibility to do that, it seems like more times than not, they're just satisfied with having one of their 2 fights a year, making that large, that large guarantee, their small amount that they may make from pay-per-view and not really fighting as actively as they need to. One of the guys who has not been like that is Canelo Alvarez. So
yeah.
Come on to him. Canelo, obviously, for folks that have been following, he fought, 4 times within a basically 12-month span, cleaned out the 168-pound division of all its champions. And he's going to be back again this May. Where do you think things stand with Canelo having had that great run from the end of 2020 through 2021 as we look forward to what he's going to possibly be doing this May?
Well, look, he sealed his Hall of Fame credentials in that stretch. And look, he's going to end up with right around 70 fights. And I get it that he started at age 15. It's a little bit different in Mexico. Things are a little bit lax with the commissions. But I think we need to appreciate guys like him because look at a lot of your careers, Q, like a guy like Shakur Stevenson, who I believe is the modern-day Pernell Whitaker. I think he's the toughest guy to beat between 30 and 40.
Wow.
I don't think he may be undefeated in 5, 6, 7, 8 years. I'm just telling you, a decade from now, me and you could be talking about, no one's still beating Shakur. But here's the problem. He doesn't have 20 fights yet.
Yeah.
He's, I think, 23 or 24.
Yeah.
At this point, he's only going to be a twice-a-year fighter. His career may not even be 40 fights.
Right.
How can you really build a base? how could you really transcend and cross over? Think about this. You know the guy that I actually defend a lot? And this is the funniest thing when people say you just hate Mayweather. No, just being fair about Mayweather, I guess, makes you a complete enemy of his. But I've always
he
said
has
this
some
about
sensitive
Mayweather.
fans out there. He has some.
Oh, they're very
fans
sensitive. People forget that Mayweather, before he got to De La Hoya, which really launched him into the second phase of his superstardom, was 39-0.
Yep.
Quinton, a lot of these kids right now that we like may not ever have 39 fights, period.
Yeah,
so when I
that's
hear
true.
these young kids talk, oh, before we become Money Mayweather, I want to put in the pretty boys. No, you don't. No, you don't.
Right.
You're not willing to put in a full decade of winning 4 different championships in 4 different divisions, being the best fighter in the world, and then having to play B-side to a guy and move up in weight to fight De La Hoya. You're not willing to do it. That's the great lie of Mayweather, that he somehow was always that guy. He wasn't. I was there when Mayweather couldn't give away tickets for Goyo Vargas. I was there when he got in the battles with Top Rank, and they wouldn't. Him and Arum wouldn't talk. He really should have had about 45 fights. If it wasn't for those disputes and then the conflict with James Prince, that got complicated. But we're looking at Q. Look at these. Some of these younger fighters. Like Teofimo Lopez, after he beat Lomachenko, thought he ruled the sport.
Yeah.
I flat out told his dad, like, look, I think your son's a great talent. All you've done is giving yourselves a shot to be a star. And they went crazy. I've been told about Shakur Stevenson, because I've told this to Top Rank. Why not get him out for 3 times a year for the next 2 years and give him a shot to really break through, to be the next great American star?
Right.
What they are told time and time again by his team, well, we're not going backwards on the money. So here's the problem. If you're not willing to do that, you have to understand, Top Rank has like 100 other fighters with a finite amount of dates on ESPN and a finite amount of money. So if you're not willing to bend, and again, I'm not asking you to fight for cheap labor or minimum wage, but there's a huge difference between fighting Oscar Valdez in a title unification bout and Steve Kim. Why should you get paid the same amount?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's one thing that is unique, is that Canelo showed that flexibility in a few fights. From everything that I heard and everything that I read, he made substantially less than his guaranteed contract when he fought Callum Smith.
Yeah.
The same thing happened when he fought Avni Yildirim. They paid him about half what he was minimum guaranteed. But what he saw was the bigger picture, which is what I think you're kind of alluding to, which is if you're allowed to use these fights as keep busy fights, as fights that help you develop when you're a guy like Shakur Stevenson, when you're a guy who's young in your career, if you're able to make those sacrifices, as you said, like Floyd Mayweather did, traveling to fight Arturo Gatti, being the B-side to Oscar, and make those sacrifices financially up front, then you can have a potential to have the payoff in the back end when you get to call and dictate all the shots in the very end.
Q, I've never seen an athlete, especially young athletes, get better by not performing. You can practice all you want. Let me just use basketball as an example. You could put up 1,000 shots a day, do all the drills, blah, blah, blah. Unless you actually play some ball and then play real games, you're never going to develop. You're not. That's just, and we have so many fighters. I love Boots Ennis. And it's funny watching Boots the last 6 months. It's like he was training for a marathon and to train to climb Mount Everest and to run a decathlete, because every tweet, man, I'm just grinding. I sparred 15 rounds, ran 18 miles, and I moved mountains. And I'm like, great, when are you fighting, though? And look how he looked his last fight. Didn't he look like a guy that hadn't been there, hadn't been out there in live competition? It matters, Q. It'll always matter.
And some of it could just be the overtraining as well. I mean, when you have so many, periods, extended periods of being out of the ring and out of fights, when you're having these long drawn out training camps, or when you're having to stay closer to your fighting weight for, longer periods of time, it could negatively affect your ability to perform in the ring. And you did something really interesting that I thought you highlighted, leading up to the Bivol Canelo fight, was mentioning about, Bivol's training regimen, and that he tries to stay, within that 45 to an hour range when it comes to training and being in camp. And I think that that's helping him out a lot, because he's able to keep that great rhythm going into fights and not seem overtrained.
Yeah, Q, what's interesting is that, and look, and he's not a guy that fights a lot anymore either. He's in that tax bracket, and it's tough to get him fights because he's still kind of avoided, believe it or not. But
Right.
that day that I was there, which is about 3 weeks before he fought Canelo, I was stunned by how quick his workout was. But you can do that when, number one, your lifestyle outside the ring, in between camps, you have to be disciplined. He's not a guy that comes into camp having to lose 30 pounds. That makes it a big difference. And you still got to have really good diet. You have to have a strength and conditioning program that is in line with boxing. But he's able to do that because he comes into camp in shape. There's really no getting in shape with him. I've seen fighters for years. And again, this is where fighters are victims, where if human nature says, Q, if I give you a fight in February, you make some money. You're making 500,000. Oh my God, you're nice and young. You're doing all that stuff. And if I don't give you anything to do in terms of a real fight till August or September, let's be honest, Q, at age 23, how many of us had that Bernard Hopkins discipline to be the B-ball of today? None of us did.
Right. No,
None of us.
No.
James Toney told me this. I couldn't believe this. James Toney told me about 2 years ago. I saw him at the Blue Moon Boxing.
Mm-hmm.
And James finally admitted.
Buddy McGregor's gym, right?
Yeah, they used to be buddies. It's no longer open after the owner died. But James Toney was the last American champion from 91 to 94 that took non-title fights for a lot less money than he'd be on HBO. And he said, Steve, I still made a lot of money, but I understood I'd rather stay busy and get paid. But James Toney said, you know what, Steve, when I started fighting less, I got lazier. He goes, he admitted it to me finally. Steve, I should have been better. I couldn't believe he said it. I was like, what? He goes, Steve, I beat myself. I go, you did? He goes, I can't believe you admitted it. He goes, well, I'm old now. I see things differently. Mm-hmm. But look at James Toney's record from 91 to 94. He fought like 26 times. Mm-hmm. And he would fight on HBO 1 week, and then a month later he'd be on like Fox Sports or some club show.
Right.
So here's the question that I have. Number one, how many of these promoters actually have that right to do that, given their exclusivity with the network? Mm-hmm. And then let's say they did. How many fighters and managers would be willing to do it?
Right.
I don't see that's the whole thing. The whole system is broken.
Yeah, no doubt. And just coming back to, last question before I appreciate your time and everything. Last question I have for you is really just kind of talking about the American boxing scene and how it really seems like a lot of these guys are not, like you mentioned, having the flexibility to go ahead and take certain fights in certain situations, whether that means crossing over to another network, whether that means traveling to another country like we possibly may see Stephen Fulton do. How do you think that is kind of blocked or kind of negated some of the opportunities for some of these guys to really build their names by taking the best opportunity that might be available to them? I think of a great example for me. You mentioned Jaron Ennis, right? Having a fight on another network, maybe fighting in another country, maybe going to the UK and having a fight with a guy like Conor Benn, having a fight with a guy who, might be more well-known that can help build his own fanfare here back in the U.S. How do you think that that's kind of dictated and kind of been to the detriment of these guys as far as their support?
I think every fighter should do it. Look, let's go down the list of the last 5-6 years. Gennady Golovkin played to a huge audience against Kell Brook. It was a big event.
Awesome fight.
Errol Spence fought Kell Brook.
Yes.
In front of like 30,000 people, right?
Another great fight.
Don't forget Tank Davis, one of his first title defenses. Liam Walsh. And I got to give the UK fans credit.
100%.
When there's a foreign fighter that's really good, those people throw their nationality out the board in the sense that they look at it as like, wow, we get to see this guy in our country. I guarantee if Inoue fought one of their British bantamweights or 22-pounders, that would sell very well because they'd be like, wow, we get to see this little monster in our part of town.
Lomachenko, same thing when he fought Luke Campbell.
Absolutely. Every fighter should do it. And Q, we are now in the modern age of social media. So there used to be a time when I first got in, if a foreign fight happened, you'd have to wait for like a month before some guy that collected VCR tapes would then mail them to you. And then you'd and then you'd have to read Ring Magazine. And then Al Gore invented the internet. You might get fight news results and you're dying to see like a minute and a half of a clip. Nowadays, look, we all can watch fights, right? There's a bunch of apps, legal and illegal. But there's other parts of the world, believe it or not, where boxing is actually the second most popular sport behind soccer. Mm-hmm. In the United States, boxing is probably no better than 6th or 7th, beyond the NHL, NFL, MLB, NBA, college sports, and maybe even the UFC. So we have to be honest about it. So if a fighter can make a high 6-figure, 7-figure payday and expand their reach and their branding internationally, why wouldn't you do it?
Right.
Why wouldn't you? And
Right.
these fans love boxing in the European countries. They love boxing, and I believe that should be done. Like Marvin Hagler had to go fight Alan Minter. He got pelted
Right.
with beer bottles from 40 feet
Exactly.
away. That's not
Yes.
the best example, but they the UK European boxing fan, I think, has a greater appreciation of elite level boxers than American fans across the board.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the other things that I've even thought of too is the fact that, when you think about these guys going and traveling, the idea of a world champion is that you fight all over the world, right?
Yeah.
We didn't see Ali only fight in Kentucky because that's where he's from. We didn't see George Foreman only have fights at the Astrodome because he's from Houston. We saw him fight all over the place because he was a world champion. And I say that all the time.
Your question brings something up. Another thing that's hurt the game of boxing, and I understand it, is the economics. We have got to get away from just having fights in Las Vegas or wherever there's a casino or the Middle East. The Middle East is the new economic stimulus. Here's the problem with the Middle East. There's a lot of money, but you alienate the hardcore fans. They're not flying over there. It's very restrictive. You can get your hand cut off for drinking a Coors Light. I'd rather not go there. I mean, I'm just sorry. I don't want to be Brittany Griner. I need to drink a little bit once in a while, okay?
Right.
I believe that there's an opportunity this year that Usyk, Fury, believe it or not, and I'm surprised, but there's a chance that could actually be in Wembley Stadium in the UK, not the Middle East, which is actually an upset, but not a done deal yet, so don't quote me. Also, if we get Fulton Inoue, that'll be in Japan, non-casino setting. So that's an organic event. Loma Haney, there's a chance it may not be in the Middle East. It might actually end up in Las Vegas.
Okay.
Now, that's a casino, but at least regular fans in America can attend, right?
Absolutely.
And I would believe that if Tank Davis against Ryan Garcia finishes or crosses the finish line, that's going to be in a real venue. So, because of so I don't like this. Every fight, well, let's just go to Dubois. That takes away half my interest in most of these events. I can't lie.
Right.
So I think if we're able to do those fights I listed in venues, that even if they're casinos, but there's at least as a chance for the regular fans to enjoy a great, memorable night, that's a net positive for the sport.
Time right there. Thank you for joining us. Thank you everybody for joining us. He does a twice a week podcast, he does a column twice a week. You can cut out weekly about what he's doing for the sport of boxing, telling the truth and reporting the truth. Steve, always appreciate the time, and we'll have to do it again sometime soon.